We're in John chapter 9 this morning, and we are essentially going to the following day right after the Feast of Booths. So we won't get into why it's probably the following day right after the last day of the festival and the Feast of Booths until, I don't know, the next week or the week after that when they start talking about the Sabbath. But for now, you should just know we're directly after the Feast of Booths. Jesus has just been teaching. We summarized that all for you last week, chapter 7, chapter 8, and then he's left the temple, and now what we're probably seeing is the following day, which would be a Sabbath day, would be what was really considered the last day of the festival. I said to you at the beginning of the Feast of Booths that they had started with a Sabbath day, then 7 days of festivaling, then another Sabbath day. So this would probably be the Sabbath day following the Feast of Booths. And essentially what we have in chapter 9, and we'll see it as we go through the whole chapter, but this is going to be comparing, contrasting essentially two types of people. The first type of person is the one who knows they're blind, and they're desperate to not be blind. And that's going to have all kinds of different ramifications. And the second group of people is the people who think they see, but they're really blind. And essentially this chapter is just going to contrast those two types of people. What does the person who know they're blind look like? And how do they respond when someone comes saying, I can help you see? And what do the people who think they see look like, sound like, talk like? And what's really happening inside is that they're really blind. One person that I read said it like this: the only sin for which there is no remedy is spiritual pride or unbelief. Basically thinking that you see, but you are really blind, he says, is the only thing that will keep you from the kingdom of God. This is essentially going to be a physical example of a spiritual reality. The focus of this chapter is not supposed to be the blind guy that gets healed. It's supposed to be the blind guy that gets saved. But a lot of people know this as the story of a blind guy who gets healed. So as we go through chapter 9, I'll show you that as we go. But here's the characters in this chapter. There's Jesus. There's Jesus' disciples. We'll see them enter as we go. And then there's a blind man who's been blind from birth. And then in this section, we're just going from verse 1 to verse 12 today, there will also be the neighbors of the blind man, essentially the people who lived in his community, who would have seen him blind and begging, and then who identified him as the guy who used to be blind. So there's the neighbors, Jesus, disciples, and the blind man, and then we'll enter more characters as we go throughout the weeks. This is going to be a little bit weird. We're going to do verses out of order, okay? Because the story repeats itself on multiple occasions for multiple different reasons. So follow me, and I'll show you where we're going and why we're going out of order. We're going to start in verse 1, then we're going to jump down to verse 6, read through the end of verse 12, and then jump back to verse 2. So follow me as we're going, and I'll show you why we're doing that. So here's essentially the story. This is the miracle that happened. This is the story. Starts in John chapter 9, verse 1, and then we'll jump down to verse 6. It says, as he, that is Jesus, passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. John chapter 9, verse 1. Then here's the story. This is the miracle that happens. Jump down to verse 6. Having said these things, we'll come back to what did Jesus say, because what Jesus said is important to understand why this story happened, but we'll get to that at the end. So verse 6, having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with his saliva. This is Jesus. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. And then you get everyone's response in verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as he was a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some said, verse 9, some said it is him. Yeah, for sure it's this guy. And others were like, no, it's not this guy, but this guy's kind of like him, but it's not the guy who was blind. And then it says in verse 9, he kept saying, the man, I am the man. So by this guy's own testimony, I am the man who was born blind, and now I see. So they said to him, this is the neighbors, the people in the crowds, how then were your eyes opened? And he answered, verse 11, the man called Jesus made mud, anointed my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he says, I don't know. So this is the beginning of the story. This is essentially the facts. There was a guy, he was born blind. Jesus passed by him, said a few things to his disciples, which we're going to go back and look at. Then he spits in the mud, spits in the dirt, makes mud with his saliva, wipes it on the guy's eyes, tells him to go to the pool, wash. He goes to the pool, wash, and now he sees. That's the basic facts of the story. Now, I want to just point out one detail before we skip over this story anymore. The fact that Jesus told this guy to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And John includes, maybe in your Bible it's in parentheses, in verse 7, John includes this detail of the pool of Siloam, which is the pool of Siloam means sent, or the pool of to be sent. So Jesus sends this guy to the pool of to be sent. Now, I'm going to play out this symbolism real quick for you just so that you don't miss it, and then you hopefully will see why Jesus did this specific thing, and then maybe you'll get it. Jesus has just left the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. And at the Feast of Tabernacles, if you go back to John chapter 7, and then you follow it all the way through John chapter 8 for the duration of the time Jesus is at the feast. John chapter 7, verse 16, 18, verse 28 and 29, verse 33, and then in John chapter 8, verse 18, 26, 29, 42, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. 9 times Jesus says, I was sent by the Father. I was sent by the Father. I was sent by God. The one who I'm talking about is the one who I was sent by. 9 times at the festival, just within the past week, he has told the people that he's talking to that he was sent by God. So, essentially, the one who was sent by God is now sending this blind man to the pool of the one who was sent so that he can receive his sight. Putting those pieces together? Wash in the pool of the one who was sent, and you'll have sight. Not physical sight, but a different kind of sight that we see by the end of this chapter. So don't miss the fact that, this was just a random pool that happened to be in Jerusalem, and Jesus said, go wash in this pool because maybe you could get there and find some water. No, the fact that Jesus was sent again and again and again, he says it, and then essentially he says to go for this guy to wash in the pool of the one who was sent. And if you do that, you can be saved. There's a whole bunch more to that as we go to the story, but I want to point that out because I'm going to come back to it in the future weeks because that will be extremely important to what Jesus is saying. You don't want to miss that. So jump back to verse 2. What does Jesus actually say about healing the blind guy? What is he doing? Why is he doing what he's doing? And then in turn, what should you and I be doing as a result of what Jesus is doing here in this story? So verse 2, Jesus has just passed by and he's seen a blind man who's been blind for birth. And then verse 2, the disciples ask him this. The disciples ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And this is common Jewish understanding at the time was that if you have some sort of defect or punishment going on in your life, like a man who's been born blind from birth, it's a result of sin. So they always put 2 and 2 together. Either his parents sinned and therefore he was born blind, or he sinned and somehow he became blind. This is the same problem that Job's friends have in the book of Job. All this bad stuff happens to Job in Job chapter 1, and basically for the rest of the book, his friends are trying to get him to admit what he's done wrong. And he keeps going to them in so many words saying, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not sinful. I don't have anything to repent over. And they're saying to him, this calamity wouldn't happen to you if you hadn't done something wrong. So why don't you just repent and get it over with, and then God will bless you again. And he keeps telling them, I haven't done anything wrong. And they, for most of the middle of the book, they just go back and forth. Job's friends are essentially this friend's trying to get him to confess, and then this friend's trying to get him to confess, and then they attack it from this angle, because there's this understanding that if something's bad's going on in your life, it's because of your sinfulness or because of your parents' sinfulness. And this was a common understanding, but it was also somewhat confusing for the Jews at this time. Some of the rabbis don't really know what to do with this all the time. Here's the reason why. If you go back to actual Old Testament law or verses or prophets, Here's what one of them says. This is Exodus chapter 20. You shall not worship them, talking about other gods. You shall not worship them. This is part of the Ten Commandments. Or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. And so they'd read verses like this, straight from Moses, and they'd say, look, God punishes people in the generation and the generation after and the generation after for the sins of the father. So we know that if this guy was born blind, maybe it was his parents or his parents' parents. We saw this play out in David's life, where David sins, and then Solomon goes astray, and then Solomon's children go astray, and there's blessing and curse as a result of their choices. But then go a little farther in the Old Testament to Ezekiel chapter 18, then rabbis get a little bit confused at this point. This is Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. The prophet says this, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So even though this was the general mindset that if something bad's happening in your life, it's probably as a result of sin, there was confusion among the Jewish people as to whether or not that was actually the sin of the parents or whether or not it was the sin of the actual person. And so the disciples just asked Jesus, was it this guy who sinned or was it his parents who sinned? Which part of what God said is he acting on in this case? Now I want you to remember before I read Jesus' answer that Jesus has set himself in the context of being the servant of God. But at this point, just in the last chapter, we talked about that a little bit at the end of the last chapter. We'll get into that more in this chapter. But at this point, they want Jesus not to be the servant. They want Jesus to be the judge. They're asking him, who sinned? You tell us. You have more knowledge than us. Who sinned? And Jesus, the problem is that he didn't come to judge. He came to be a servant. And so they're pulling him out of the context that he was originally supposed to be in, which is why he doesn't answer their question directly. So verse 3, Jesus says, I'll take door number 3. And he goes kind of a different direction. Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So lots of people, when they're going through life, myself included, when we ask the question, why? All the time. We go through life, we ask why. And there's 2 possible answers to that question. The first one is for us to be asking about causality. Why does Scott have a spot on his shirt during worship this morning? And Scott would say, I'm pretty sure I didn't have a spot on my shirt, because he didn't. But if he did have a spot on his shirt, he would be like, I was drinking my coffee this morning and I spilled coffee on my shirt and now there's a spot on my shirt. So that's why. We're asking causality. We go to God and we say, why did these things happen in my life? Is it something that I did? Can I do something differently? Is it something that someone else did? Do I have any control over this? And we ask, why? And what we're really seeking is causality. That's the question that the disciples asked Jesus, who caused this man to be born blind? Was it his own sin or was it the sin of his parents? And essentially Jesus says, you're asking the wrong question. You're asking why, but the problem is not causality, the problem is purpose. So they ask for an answer to causality and Jesus doesn't give them that answer. What he gives them is an answer to the question that why that involves purpose. What's the purpose of this man being born blind? So if I were to ask Julie, who's right behind the camera here, why did you come this morning? Why did you show up? She would say, well, I showed up so I could live stream you. I mean, if you use my phone, I log into the account, and so that's the purpose of why she showed up. That's essentially the question that Jesus answers here. And the answer that he gives in verse 4 is, so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Here's the reason why I bring that up. Because I think this happens to us all the time. I think that all the time we're going through life and we get stuck on causality. Why did this happen to me, God? What happened in the past? And it's really, I don't know if it's the same for you, but for me it's a control issue. Why did this happen to me in the past? Because if I can understand why this happened to me in the past, then maybe I could prevent it from happening in the future. And so you go to God and say, why did this happen? I'll do anything to have this not happen again. And sometimes I think God gives us the answer. It's not about why this happened in the past. It's about the purpose of what I'm doing with it now. Maybe the answer to why this happened in the past is not necessarily about the sequence of events that brought it about, but more about what is God doing with it in the moment. So people ask maybe questions like, why did my parents neglect me? I mean, what would cause them to do that? I mean, what would cause them to ignore me or pretend like I don't exist or not give me the affection that I need? Why did my spouse cheat on me, or why did someone abuse me? And we want to know why. Sometimes I wonder if the why would really help us at all. Or if what we're really looking for an answer to is, God, what are you going to do with this? What's the purpose of letting me experience this? What's the purpose of letting me go through all this? Is it all for nothing? Just for pain's sake in my own life? It's not always a bad thing to understand why things happened in the past. I just think it's interesting here that Jesus doesn't seem concerned with causality. He seems to be entirely concerned with what's the purpose. We don't always have to have the answers as to the domino effect of how things happen in our life in order to be able to ask God, what are you going to do with this? And how is it going to change my life? How are you going to take this and make it good? The danger is, I think, when we're overly focused on causality, we miss the purpose of why God let us experience the trial or experience the hardship that we're having in our life. In this case, a blind man. What was the chain of events that led up to him being blind? I'm sure if God wanted to, he could give him the scientific answer of exactly what happened in the womb and what happened to this man as to why scientifically he was born without sight. But how much less satisfying is that, even if you had all that knowledge, than to know the entire purpose that I was born blind was so that the work of God might be on display. He seems to get at the heart of what we're all really looking for, even though we don't always necessarily ask for it. Here's what Jesus tells his disciples in the next verse. This is what I want to kind of key in on this morning. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. This is where it starts to get a little bit weird. These verses can throw you for a loop if you don't understand that you're not the same as Jesus. So Jesus lumps his disciples in this time. We have to do the works of God. And he says, then as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And that can throw you off too. So I need to explain a little bit. If you heard the message that I gave on John chapter 6, verse 28 and 29, maybe you'll have a little bit of context. If not, I'll summarize it for you, and then this will help you understand. Because Jesus has said the same thing that he's saying here, he's essentially already said to the Jews in Galilee when he was in John chapter 6. And if you don't understand that you're not the same as Jesus, then you'll be confused by what he's saying here. Here's John chapter 6, verse 28, 29. Then they, the crowds who are in Galilee, they said to him, that is Jesus, what must we do to be doing the works of God? And Jesus answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. So if you heard the message that I gave when we were in John chapter 6, I had made this distinction that Jesus is doing the work of God and we're doing the work of God. And essentially, both of us are together doing the will of God together. But because Jesus is God in the flesh, and because we're human and only human and not God, that means that the will of God for Jesus is slightly different than the will of God for us. The will of God for Jesus is that he always does what's pleasing to the Father, and therefore the Father never leaves him. He says that to the Jews when he's in at the feast. But we cannot always do what's pleasing to the Father all the time. So the will of God then for Jesus is to be 100% perfect in his action. But that's obviously not the will of God for us, because we can't do it. It would be unrealistic. If that were the case, we'd all go to hell and we'd be wasting our time here on Sunday mornings every week. So it's important to understand that you and I are not the same as Jesus, and so the work of God, while we may do it together with Jesus, is not exactly the same in the purposes that it accomplishes. So, do the will of God. So when Jesus says, so go back to verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. So the work of Jesus is to obey the Father at all times. But back in John chapter 6, he told the crowds, the work of you and I is to believe. So the work of God is to be obedient to the Father, and the work of you and I is to believe. And now, in this context where they're now sharing with this blind man, he's receiving sight, and by the end of this chapter, the blind man will be a believer. What we see is that Jesus follows the Father to do his will. We believe, and then as a result of us believing, we then follow Jesus to also do the will of God, meaning evangelism, obedience, these sorts of things. So I want you to maintain these two categories as I read this. So for Jesus, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. For Jesus, the daytime is when he's on earth. When he's doing his earthly ministry, he's essentially telling them, I'm not going to be on earth forever. There's going to be a day for me and a night for me. There's going to be a daytime when I'm on earth and I'm doing the works of God on earth. And then there's going to be a night. That doesn't mean that Jesus is not in control anymore. It just means that he's not on earth doing ministry. So in the next half of the verse where it says, night is coming when no one can work. That's Jesus saying, eventually I'm not going to be on earth doing earthly work anymore. While it's the day, I'm going to heal blind people and make sure they come to faith. And then there's going to be a time when I'm no longer going to be on the earth. The reason why that's important is because the Jews believed that when the Messiah came, he would come into power, be the king, and rule for forever. So if they're really thinking that he's the Messiah, that's the picture that they have in their mind. This guy's the Messiah, he's going to come, eventually he's going to be king, and then he's going to rule forever. And he's trying to tell them, my time is limited here. While it is day, we're going to do the work of God, and then it's going to be night, and I'm not going to be able to work anymore physically here on earth. Now, he's in control in heaven, and he's sent the Spirit of God so that he continues ministry here, but his physical presence is no longer here. That's what it means for Jesus. The question is, what does it mean for you and I? We must work the works of God while it is day, Jesus says to his disciples. So I want you to understand that while working the works of Jesus during the day is while he's alive and on the earth. For you and I, day is referencing the time when we live, when we're alive, when we have breath in our lungs, when we still have time to believe and to obey. I'll put it to you like this, maybe a little bit different illustration, but maybe helpful. While it's still day, we have time, you and I, to reflect the light. Anyone ever been confused at the fact that Jesus says in John chapter 8, I am the light of the world? But in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you are the light of the world. I am the light of the world when I'm standing in the temple and I'm trying to make this illustration to everybody else. But you are the light of the world. And everybody go, huh? Like, how's that possible? How either I'm the light of the world or he's the light of the world. But it just doesn't make any sense for us both to be the light of the world unless there is a source and a reflection. If there's a source and a reflection, then it makes absolute sense for him to be the light of the world, source, and us to be the light of the world, reflection. So, in other words, while we're on earth, while it is still day, while we still have breath in our lungs, there's time for us to reflect the source of the light of the world, for us to literally be the light of the world, to believe and to reflect that light. So then the question is, what's the night for us? We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. So then night essentially would be for us when we're dead. Because if we're dead, you can't work to have faith any longer. The time for you to have faith is over. And we cannot be obedient. We cannot bring people to Christ because it's the night. There's no more time for you to work. So this is why I say it gets a little bit confusing, because Jesus is including everybody together. We have to do the works of God. But at the same time, in order to understand this, you have to understand that his works of God are slightly different than our works of God. His day is different than our day. His night is different than our night. And if you don't understand that, you will get extremely confused by what he's saying here. As long as I am in the world, he says, I am the light of the world. And this is again a reference to the ending of his earthly ministry. Be careful not to overinterpret. Jesus is not saying anything about the future state of the light after he leaves the earth. He's simply saying, while I'm here, I am the light of the world. So I would challenge you not to overread any more into that statement, but only to let it affirm what it affirms. So if our purpose is to believe and reflect the light while we're on earth, then the reality is we should look at the things that happen in our life and not be concerned with causality, but be concerned with purpose. God, what's the purpose of these things happening in my life? So that you might believe and reflect the light. God, what's the purpose of this relationship turning into a mess? So that you might believe and reflect the light. Why was I born this way? Why do I have this defect? Why did you allow this person to abuse me? So that you might believe and reflect the light. It all goes back to the same purpose. The problem is we a lot of times get stuck on the cause. And I think, like I said before, it's really a control thing. At least that's what I've identified in my life. It's because I would love to have control and be in control. And I love not to be at the whim of God, because it feels safer to be in control myself. If I just know what happened and why it happened, I can just keep it from happening and then won't have to ever experience pain again. But it doesn't work. At some point we have to get to the point where we realize that God is using these things in our life to help us believe. And are they painful? Yes. Does that make them any less painful? Not in the slightest. Does it make them any more clear as to why they happened? Maybe not. But what's the purpose of them happening? Yeah, it should be. So that you might believe, so that you might reflect the light. You can spend your life asking why. Or you can say, all of this life, ups, downs, positives, negatives, it must be so that I believe. Must be so that I would turn and glorify God. Must be so that when people see me worship God in the midst of pain and trials and a mess, they say, wow, that person has something that I've never seen before. Or why would they worship at a time like this? Why would they have joy at a funeral? Why when they're persecuted would they rejoice? If you don't get this now, and certain things happen in the coming days of our country, and things change, biblical values could end up being persecuted very shortly. And if we can't figure out how to stop asking God, why did all these things happen? But instead, what are you doing? And how can we believe in you to a deeper extent? How can we reflect your light to the rest of the world? We will be lost here in the next months, years, 10 years. Have to figure this out now. Wash in the pool of the one who was sent. Believe, reflect the light. While it is still day, you have time. When it is night and you have no more time, time's up. To reflect the light, time's up to believe. You only have the day, which is the time when you have breath in your lungs. I'll pray real quick and then give you a couple more announcements about tomorrow. God, help us to see this story for the purpose that it really is. Over the years, people have read stories like this, and still, even when you get to the end of the story, they've been focused on what's the cause. Oh, if you just have faith, or if you just follow Jesus, then people who are around you would receive their sight, or you would pray for healing and they would receive it. And even still, reading the whole story, they focus on cause. When you're trying to redirect us to understand that sometimes it just doesn't matter what the cause is. Sometimes the only thing that matters is what, God, are you doing with it? So God, for everybody going through something this morning where they've been asking you that question, God, why did this happen? Why did this happen? How could I change it? How can I make it better? How can I make sure this never happens to me again in the future? Maybe, God, they would be open this morning to just have you say, the purpose is that you reflect the light. And I'm not going to tell you why or how everything happened. I'm just going to tell you that it's refining you and it's for my glory. And so that we would walk close with you, not need all the answers to every question, but that we might know that you're getting glory as a result, and that alone would bring us comfort, not having all the answers. So God, as we continue studying this story in the weeks to come, would you keep reminding us of that? It's not about the healing of the blind man. It's about saving someone's soul. It's not about physical healing. It's about salvation for all eternity. Help us to keep our eyes focused on what's important as we deal with each other, what's important as we deal with trials in life, to stay focused, to stay unified in your life, your death, your resurrection, how you loved us. And just let everything else be less important than the gospel and the truth and how that changed our lives. God, thank you for your Son. Pray all this in his name. Amen.